So in this post, all I want to do is document the degree to which Catholicism, as it is manifested in the modern world, is a force which promotes leftism. Now, the fact that this is true is interesting, I think, for at least two reasons. So, one of the reasons is that historically this is not true. Right? If you went back to the 19th century or the early 20th century, you would have found liberalism to be associated with progressivism, not Catholicism, and Catholicism to be associated with a very traditionalist take on morality, although perhaps still a left or what we would now call a more left-wing view on economics, maybe. And in the second place, I think it's interesting because on the far right, it seems to me that there are more and more people who are Catholic and who seem to view Catholicism as a force for traditional morality and conservatism, even in the modern world, relative to Protestantism. That's also interesting, I guess, just because it's normally not noted, the degree to which this is true and a universal phenomena. So, looking at the data, in the first place, we see that the percentage of a country that is Catholic positively correlates with the degree to which people say that homosexuality is morally acceptable. The absolute values here are lower than what we would see today, obviously, because this poll is from some time ago. The same is seen if we ask people, is divorce morally acceptable? And it's worth noting, obviously, this isn't just a racial effect, because this seems to be true even when comparing European countries, as most of these countries are. Now, in an analysis that I previously did looking at European countries, I found a very strong correlation, a correlation of 0.45 between the economic freedom score of a European country and the proportion of it that is Protestant today. We can also see this by looking within specific countries. So in Britain, Catholics are far more likely than average to vote Labour. The same was true at least in the early 2000s for Canada. There are narrative articles claiming that this is no longer true, but I have not been able to find any national polling data on Catholics in Canada more recently. And I guess it's worth noting that Justin Trudeau, obviously, is a left-wing leader of Canada and is a Catholic. In Australia, polling there finds that Catholics are more likely than other Christians to support same-sex marriage. This has been found apparently in at least 2 polls in recent years in Australia. And in Brazil, apparently, Protestants are more likely than average to support Bolsonaro, this right-wing populist figure. And so from that, we can reasonably infer that Catholics are more likely to support more left-wing governments, which isn't terribly surprising, I guess, given that Latin America has been ruled by Catholics for decades, and the result of that has been basically widespread socialism in most of the countries. Now, in America, as I've talked about on this channel before, the majority of whites from non-Protestant nations in Europe, that is, if you look at Americans today and ask them, where did your ancestors come here from? Well, the ones from Catholic European countries are net Democrats. The ones from Protestant countries are much more likely to be Republicans. Virtually all of the countries that send us net Republicans are Protestant countries, or at least historically Protestant countries. Even not looking at people from Europe, even among Asian Americans, funnily enough, it is true that Protestant Asian Americans lean heavily Republican, while Catholic Asian Americans are pretty evenly split between identifying as a Republican and a Democrat. Now, if we look at how white people vote in the United States based on religion, we see that white Catholics go back and forth, suggesting that white Catholics, too, are these sort of 50-50 split on whether or not they are really Republicans or Democrats. They go back and forth as to whether they vote on net for the Democrat or Republican candidate. By contrast, Protestants do not do this. Protestants vote very solidly Republican in every election. And we can see here data going back a little further, because in that previous graph it just went back to 1972. This one goes back to 1960. And the line being above 0 basically indicates a propensity to vote for Democrats, and the line being below 0 indicates a propensity to vote Republican. And in the 60s, it was even more true. And in 1960, it was insanely true that Catholics leaned Democrat. And of course, in 1960, these Catholics are virtually all white. This is before mass Hispanic immigration into the United States. Now, concerning the 1960 election, which of course had a Catholic on the ballot, we see that, quote, 67% of Catholics who had previously supported Eisenhower in 56 actually ended up voting for Kennedy, presumably because he was Catholic, so that Kennedy won 70% of the Catholic vote. Kennedy received about 70% of the Italian vote, 66% of the Polish vote, 68% of the Irish vote, and 50% of the German Catholic vote, which I think is very interesting because Germans, as an ethnic group in the United States in general, have voted solidly Republican for a long time. Overall, Germans in the 1960 election voted Republican. So we see, again, religion exerting an influence here that is not explicable merely in terms of ethnicity. We also see that, now the Protestant vote, Kennedy did not win. His support among Protestants, depending on the poll you look at, ranged from 46 to 38%. Sometimes the 1960 election is portrayed as if it was an event of tolerance in the United States, as if we'd come around to accept Catholics as Americans, and so Kennedy's election, being a great symbol of that, is just not true. The fact of the matter is that what happened in the 1960s was not that Protestants came around to Catholics, but rather that they had let so many Catholics in that via their higher birth rates, they virtually just took over the electorate. And starting in the 1960s, the electoral politics at the national level of the United States no longer was in the hand of Protestants. I mean, I showed you before that white Protestants virtually always vote Republican overall in presidential elections. Obviously, we do not always get Republican presidents. To some degree, that is because of the black vote, but it is also very heavily because of the Catholic vote. Now, if we turn to specific policies instead of voting, we see that in America, Catholics have been to the left of Protestants forever with respect to whether or not gay sex is wrong, and with respect to the question of whether or not it is okay for unmarried couples to cohabitate. Looking at data from the General Social Survey, I did some analyses. I restricted it so that we're only looking at non-Hispanic whites, and this data is all fairly recent, I think from the year 2000 or later. And what we see is that while Catholics, for instance, on the position of abortion, are on net pro-life and conservative, they are not pro-life to the degree that Protestants are. So they are left-leaning relative to Protestants. The same is true if you ask them questions about welfare. So Catholic voters are to the left of Protestant voters, and this is true whether you're looking at policy or partisanship, and this has had a real effect on our elections. Many of the Democrat presidents we've had since 1960, including Kennedy himself, would not have been presidents at all had it not been for these Catholic voters. The Republican Party, I should say, also might have been very different if it was not engaged in this very long struggle to try to capture the votes of these left-leaning white Catholics. This is something that happened long before the attempts to get Hispanic votes was the attempt to get just white Catholic votes. It's actually kind of funny. You can read material from the 19th century Republicans talking about how they need to go softer on immigration in order to attract the votes of German Catholics. But anyway, turning away from the voters, let's look at the elite. So there's this great 1969 study where they went and found 60,000 American university faculty members. It was commissioned by the government, which is why they were able to get such a large sample. And as we can see, Catholic academics were to the left of Protestant ones. Now, of course, here, that is not the number that jumps out. If you look at this, the Jewish numbers jump out more, but this video is more about Catholics than Jews. But of course, it is true that Catholics, yes, they were to the left of Protestants, but not to nearly the degree that Jewish academics were. Now, we can use this data to infer the representation of Jews, Catholics, and Protestants among academics of different political orientations. And if we look at the leftist academics, what we see is that they are 56% Protestant, 29% Jewish, and 16% Catholic. By contrast, the strongly conservative academics, 83% Protestant, 14% Catholic, and 3% Jewish. But these numbers would be different if we looked in more elite universities, because Catholics and Jews were more common in elite universities than in more lower-tier universities. And they were more common among young professors than old professors. So that if you look at, in 1969, the demographics of professors aged 29 years and younger, so the new professors, in elite universities, only 52% of them in total were Protestant. Now what this means is that it is almost certainly true that the majority of leftist academics who came to dominate the left in the coming decades, in the 70s and 80s, were not Protestants. It might even be true that even at this time, the majority of left-wing academics in elite universities who really set the ideological agenda were not Protestants. And that's an amazing thing given the degree to which the United States at the time was a Protestant nation. And we can see the same thing looking at the Supreme Court. Firstly, there's research showing that Catholic judges and Jewish judges rule in ways that are more left-leaning than the way Protestant judges rule. And then we look at the Supreme Court today, and again, it's just an amazing degree of overrepresentation and underrepresentation. The fact is, there's not a single member of the Supreme Court that was raised in a Protestant home. There's debate about whether or not Gorsuch has converted from Roman Catholic to Episcopalian. Not totally clear one way or the other, but he certainly was raised Roman Catholic, and every other judge is either a Jew or a Roman Catholic. So what we see is that in America, among the elites, in our elections, internationally, Catholics exert a left-wing influence. They do so in a way that is different from how Jews tend to do so, because Jewish people tend to exert a left-wing influence just by influencing the elite of a country. Catholics do influence the elite. They do move the judges and the academics to the left, and they did help create a left, which in the late 20th century in the United States was majority non-Protestant. People sometimes ask the question, why did liberalism change so much? If you look in the early 20th century, and you have the progressive movement, which has some similarities with the modern left, but some very strong differences, especially with respect to rhetoric concerning equality and the like, and its sort of attitude towards outsiders, groups of the other, quote unquote, and this sort of thing. And I think one of the reasons for that is just that you're not talking about the same people. In the early 20th century, the progressive movement is very heavily dominated by Protestants in the United States. By the time you get to the 1970s, the left in the United States is dominated by non-Protestants. But even setting aside that elite influence, Catholics, unlike Jewish people, can exert a real influence on elections by just voting in mass, because there's so many of them. Now, of course, there are WASPs who have exerted a left-wing influence too, even in the more modern left. And some Catholics have been right-wing, even in the modern age. But their net influence as groups, I think, is pretty clear, at least if we're talking about the last 60 years. And I think it's also probably fair to say that the WASPs of the early 20th century, who said that Catholic and Jewish immigration would fundamentally change the nation's political identity, were correct in that assessment. That's the main point of this video, just to document the leftist influence of Catholicism. I'm not going to attempt to explain it here. That might be a topic for a future video. But this video is really just about raising people's consciousness, so to speak, concerning the facts about the left-wing influence of Catholicism, because my impression is that in right-wing circles, it's not even realized the degree to which Catholics, relative to Protestants, do act in these left-wing ways. So, there you go.